Hello, everyone. My name is Belinda Uwase. I'm the Artist Programs Coordinator with STEPS. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the CreateSpace Reimagining Community Engagement in Public Space panel talk. I'm so honored to be hosting this and to be introducing our lovely moderator and panelists tonight for this discussion. Just some general housekeeping again for those of you just joining. We do have closed captioning available, so if you need to do so, please see the CC icon on your Zoom toolbar for subtitle settings. Again, this is a recorded talk, just so you're all aware, and it is also being live streamed through Facebook. For ASL and LSQ interpretation, which is also available for this talk, they should be spotlighted, but if you wish to pin the interpreters, please also do so and highlight them on your screen by clicking the top right-hand corner button. And also, if you need simultaneous French translation, please click the interpretation globe icon in your Zoom toolbar and select French. Yeah, without further ado, thank you all for being here today. STEPS fosters dynamic and inclusive communities through public art and creative placemaking. We transform urban spaces into vibrant places through cultural planning, community arts, and artist capacity building programs. Before we begin, I would just like to do a land acknowledgement, and before we open up conversations to how we reimagine community engagement. At STEPS, we wish to acknowledge the sacred land on which we are meeting on tonight. It's been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The territories include the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, taking only what is needed and ensuring the dish is never left empty for others. Today, I'm also in the meeting place of Te Toronto, which is a home to a large, active, and diverse urban Indigenous community from many nations across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to use this land to share ideas and generate creativity. As a public arts organization, we recognize our privilege in working on stolen and unceded lands and are working in the chat. You will see that we have shared a link to nativeland.ca. This is a great starting point to help learn about the traditional Indigenous territories we currently reside in, as well as the treaties, communities, and languages. We encourage everyone else, as this is a talk that's hosted online and people are joining from all over, to learn about the lands that they call home and about the Indigenous communities that we share this land with today. We're grateful to all those that came before us. For any tech support, our engagement team will be available and we'll have guidance. I please ask that you remain muted for the remainder of the talk. We will have a Q&A session towards the end, but if you could keep your questions until then, that'd be great. Yeah, again, closed captioning is available. And yeah, so thank you all for joining us tonight again. Welcome to Reimagining Community Engagement. For those of you joining us, you're probably aware that this is a collaboration with Shaping Space. And we have our lovely moderator, Anna Jane McIntyre from Quebec, who will be joined by panelists Lindsey Lickers from Ontario, Jaime Calayo from Alberta, and Kayla Bernard from Nova Scotia. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the rest of the talk to Anna, and she will introduce the rest of the panelists. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Belinda. Yes, I mean, I love these kinds of conversations, and I was very excited to be asked to participate. So thank you, STEPS, for the trust. The first thing that I would like to say is that we created a Google Doc, because I think one of the most beautiful things about these Zoom gatherings is being able to collect everybody's like contact information so that we can create like a cross, an international and national collective of people who are interested in collaborating and supporting one another. So I'm going to put the link in the chat, and probably it will have to be as the chat disappears. I know that has to be added a few times, so I'm happy to do that. So I this Google Doc in 2021 at other conferences. So there's a collection of names there. So just choose a spot and you can add yourself. There you go. It's in there. It should be open, and you can add your information. And just with the understanding that this is a public document, so people can see your details. And I think it's really fun to be able to collaborate and continue the conversation, because in an hour and a half, we really are just dipping our toes into the waters. I hope I'm not speaking too quickly for the interpreters, and let me know. Sometimes I speak quick. Okay, and Belinda is asking if I still want to share that. Yes, I will share that. So I'm going to actually, I always think it's safer to share from. So this is a Zoom world. I myself, over these several years, have become accustomed to the awkward eye contact and silences. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. So I have created 3 Jamboards, and I'm hoping that people can participate as they wish. If they want to add anything, I will talk about the Jamboard in a second. For those of you who are not familiar with Jamboard, it's a very fun tool available on in the Google Drive, and you can very quickly create a collective document where people can write notes and whatever links, share resources. Unfortunately, it's not all on the same page, but the fun thing is that you can download it later and create a PDF. All right. So, smaller. Anyways, okay. So I am a visual artist. I am based in Montreal, Canada, but I'm an immigrant to Canada and have moved around a lot. But I've been in Canada since I was about 2 years old. I've lived all over. I've lived in British Columbia. My family's first settled in Saskatchewan, and we just moved often. We moved into 3 different places in Saskatchewan, and then we ended up in Ontario. We moved around there. And I guess I was always struck as an immigrant by the different cultures, and that I learned from a very early age how you can be speaking the same language but not necessarily always making a connection. So that has really informed my work. So I'm a microactivist, which means that I'm really grassroots, and I'm just trying to make small gestures how I can, when I can. And when I create an artwork, it's generally immersive to sort of create a common context that's both familiar and strange for people. So this is not to promote myself or talk about myself. but just so that you sort of understand how I approach things and where I'm coming from. I myself have ADHD, but I didn't find out until I was an adult, and helped make sense. I just say that in support of other people who have ADHD. And just so with the ADHD and just also being an immigrant and not looking like anybody, I use the arts to create a sense of belonging and create a place where I could exist effortlessly. So it really just, the arts just really from a very early age just allowed me to like survive because I couldn't really relate to the other kids and their interests. I was really fascinated with like forests and bugs and science. Not Barbies. Anyways, so as an immigrant, I don't know if other immigrants also had this, but I found that our family had like a really sort of like special connection with materials, and that materials sometimes take the place of people, and also can represent almost like people that you can't access easily, or like past times and past cultures. And so all objects that we have tend to have like lots of stories. And when they get picked up with my family, people often like start talking about the things that they remind me of. So I created this work is called La Forêt Noire, and it's in a forest that I created. And then inside is a collection of objects, both made and collected. You know, my brother and sister didn't really want to take responsibility for the objects, so I ended up with that job of keeping everything. So I've made 2 other blank jam boards that we can all collectively edit together. There's the contact list. This is all on the jam board. It's just on my computer right now because it's less quirky. And that's our first question. I'm going to stop the share. And I'm going to share the link for this Jamboard, okay? Just make sure I got 1, 2, 3. So here's the Jamboard that I just presented. There you go. So you can look at it and add to it. We thought it was a good idea if everybody introduces themselves. So I will pass off the next introduction to panelist Kayla, if that's okay. Do you want to introduce? Okay, you got it. Okay.
It's all good. Somebody else's name went in the chat, so I was a little confused. So, hi everyone. My name is Kayla Bernard. I'm from the community Espaganaggity First Nations, but I reside in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and identify as an urbanized Indigenous woman. I work in the field of community youth development at Heartwood Center for Community Youth Development. Kind of weird. Names are both there. But I work at the intersection of youth development in the community. And so my role as a recreation therapist there is to support young people to become their best selves, while also helping the community and the adults in their lives and the government learn how to also support them to become their best selves. Because we know in my work that when we only support one side of the equation, the other side doesn't catch up. And we just have frustrated young people who are awesome, ready to take on the world that's not ready for them. And that's who I am. Thank you.
Thank you. Lindsey, did you want to go next?
Definitely can. So Ani Bojo Mushkiiki Nibi Kwe Indigenous Mizikendo Dem, the Six Nations, Misakekindunjaba. So what I just said in my language is that my spirit name is Mushkiiki Nibi Kwe, which translates to Medicine Water Woman. And I am Turtle Clan, originally from Six Nations of the Grand River, but also have matriarchal ties to the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. So I identify as both Ongohowe as well as an Anishinaabe. and I've been a practicing artist for 15 years now, and currently split my practice between Toronto, Ontario, the Six Nations, where I'm speaking to you from my home territory. And I also have 12 years of experience specifically working within community arts facilitation, Indigenous governance, and community development and engagement and advocacy. So I do a lot of, obviously, like program development, hands-on, arts community workshops and things like that within my arts practice. But I think I carry a very unique lens in some of these spaces because of my extensive experience on the social work side as well. So I currently am the community safety liaison for the Ontario Native Women's Association. And primarily my role in that area is capacity building for individuals, for communities, for community service providers, as well as survivors who are trying to do essentially better advocacy, as well as frontline practices supporting survivors of human trafficking, as well as gang involvement. So yeah, that combined with my arts practice obviously provides me with a very unique lens. And currently, I've been contributing a bit more in the arts around doing Indigenous advisory for STEPS Public Art is one, as well as the Toronto Arts Council. So I sit on their Indigenous Advisory Committee, but also on their Board of Directors, Indigenous Rep. And really my community arts side and also my governance pieces are really speaking to reconciliation processes, policy, and then a big component of that is community engagement as we're kind of moving into a new era of trying to, create inclusive space, trying to amplify Indigenous voices, Indigenous arts, but also, how we actually promote inclusion across the board, while also acknowledging that, Canada is actively in conversations and actually consulting Indigenous nations, which is actually very new in a sense. It's something that we are doing more of now, but we're definitely still learning and trying to piece pieces together around what that looks like. So that's me in a nutshell. Miigwech now.
Thank you. And Jaime?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jaime Calayo, and I hail from Edmonton, Alberta, from Treaty 6 territory, traditional ancestral territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux. I was first connected to the land when my family immigrated to Canada from the Philippines in 1990. There are many things that connect me to the land, and it changes every day. For me, today, that thing is the river, which is our Saskatchewan River. I was fortunate to have lunch by the river today. So that's the thing that connected me to the land today. I work for an organization called Reach Edmonton, Council for Safe Communities, and we work with numerous communities and organizations around Edmonton to address issues of safety and well-being. So I kind of bringing the perspective to today's conversation, not so much from the realm of art, but more so from the realm of community organizing. I did have the opportunity to do my master's in social innovation, and as my thesis, I wanted to explore around how we might reimagine public engagement. And I ended up developing a new of public engagement method, which I like to call foresight walks, which is a combination of taking speculative fiction from the future and understanding the priorities and thoughts and feelings of people in the present and combining them together, and then packaging it in a type of futuristic Jane's Walk, where people can walk through it and hear a story of the future while they're walking into that space. So they get to kind of think about the possibilities that might exist in that space. So it's that type of innovative approach to public that gets me really excited, and trying to find opportunities to incorporate art into public engagement, because I find that art is such a great way for people to unlock that part of their brain where they just can imagine and generate new ideas. To be a part of the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. You all have very fascinating practices. Wow. I think I don't want to necessarily be completely systematic with the questions. So I'd rather have something that, like, because I have endless questions. So I can review some of the questions, and then maybe if someone feels strongly enough to speak out about one of the questions that they feel that we should urgently dive into, that would be great.
Parmi ces questions qui vous parlent davantage d'emblée, ben, ça pourrait être celle-là qu'on abordera pour commencer. Alors, on a déjà parlé un peu de ces questions de modification, mais on peut bien sûr rire. Et puis, si vous voulez m'interrompre alors que je parle des questions, on va le faire. Alors, première question, que faites-vous et pourquoi le faites-vous? Qu'est-ce qui a changé en fonction de la pandémie?
Did you have, and how did these realizations change you and your practice? And how do you think and foster community engagement now? I'm going to put these questions in the chat because you can review them. Start there. Do any of those questions speak to you? Do you feel urgent to respond to any of them?
I could go. So motivationally, I mean, you heard a little bit about kind of what I do. So, you know, and this isn't just based off of my work title. I just happen to be in this role, I guess maybe because that is something that I'm very passionate about. But ultimately, you know, what I look at around community engagement, creating spaces is really creating safety and creating, and also looking at that actually in understanding that we are where we are in terms of history, right? And that all of those pieces are really connected to each other. So, you know, myself, at least from my own experience, as well as an artist, but also as an Indigenous woman, right? Moving through, I also had a very, as much as I did learn quite a bit from my undergrad, I also experienced a lot of systemic racism and, you know, issues in terms of institutionalized, you know, oppressive policy, like having that impact myself as an artist, but also my practice. So really, like, that's kind of how it started to how I am today, of really being highly focused on advocacy, right? To advocate for myself in those spaces. And so I recognize how, and especially with something as vulnerable as an arts practice, right? As vulnerable as creation. I don't want to speak for anybody else, I never would, but from artists, that other artists I talk about, you know, that process of creation is a very intimate process. And actually, if we look at that in terms, this makes me think back to things that I have learned over my career, and then also combined with my access and reclamation of culture and traditions and history, even, because that was what my undergrad was about, to now being, you know, me going to Mushkiiki, which is a traditional helper, so a ceremonial helper. So all combined, it kind of talks about, you know, our recognition of that, you know, the need for creating safer spaces. I say safer because I don't think that there's such a thing as an actual safe space until we start to address colonial policy and are actually decolonizing processes. And I would even argue at some points too that is that actually a possibility, right? Is it actually possible to decolonize colonial spaces? And should we be doing that? Right? So I know I might be making more questions, but that's what I think about, and that's part of the motivation of what I do. A lot of colleagues and a lot of friends in my community, in communities too, various communities, because I'm also mixed, right? So I have a responsibility to my Ongwahonwe brothers and sisters, but also my Anishinaabe brothers and sisters. I have to walk, you know, 3 paths, not just 2, right? So, you know, having that understanding, but also recognizing that there's a lot of individuals that don't really even believe in that. They don't necessarily believe in reconciliation. And that's 100% valid as well. So, however, I think for myself, looking at combined my own experience, especially acquiring an arts practice in Toronto, right, in an urban center, your safety is that much more prevalent in your, especially when you're kind of navigating spaces. And then also, and then also, you know, understanding that, you know, it's one of those things where if we want to get to a place where people are, you know, wanting to participate even in these types of conversations, we need to do our best to create those spaces. So I'm very passionate about it, but also specifically passionate about reconciliation programming. I think that's really important. And I could go on about my stance on what that looks like, but I'll stop it there. That's one of my main motivations of why I do what I do.
Thank you. That's so generous. And I have a question. I always think a good conversation generates like more questions. Yes, me too. I really have a strong sense of protection, because I don't know, from working in so many different places, it's shocking, like the school system. I've seen shocking things, and I think one of the most powerful antidotes to capitalism is conversation, and like safety completely exists. I think you have to have that within yourself and then have boundaries. But the thing is that because there's so much silencing with capitalism, it's very tricky when you speak up.
Yeah, well, I would add to the other thing that just came to my mind as you were speaking was around, you know, also recognizing and shining a light to who's always talking, whose voices are heard, right? Who have to struggle to be heard, right? So that's something that I think, like, when you're in a position where, at least for myself, like I've stuck my neck out so many times to the point now where I'm like, bring it. Like I don't mind being in the fire of that, because I can handle that conversation, and other people are not necessarily there. As to community, to artists, to, you know, really anybody who is racialized, really, when it comes right down to it, which is really ironic for our country because of the way that it was founded, right? If we think about that history and that legacy. So
I just want to say one small thing, and then I'll try not to talk too much, but I often wonder about reconciliation and about developing new languages to create these new spaces, because it sort of fictionalizes the past, you know, like it wasn't a peaceful relationship to begin with. Did anybody else want to hop in with any of those questions?
Sure. Yeah, I could maybe talk about what motivates me. For me, public engagement is fascinating because of what happens afterwards. For me, I love it. I love seeing what happens afterwards when good public engagement happens. When good public engagement happens, you see people own the thing happening in the community. You see them champion the changes that are happening in the community. You see them build trust in the folks that are enacting the changes in the community. And on the flip side of that, I'm motivated by public engagement because of how horrible it could be done sometimes. And what happens after bad community engagement, you have people not trusting the process. And that's the big thing for me is how do we maintain trust in the community, and public engagement is the first way to do that. It's amazing how people will reject amazing art or amazing projects in the community because the public engagement was done so poorly. Just a very close proximity project. We have a new public library that opened up in the community. Very fun and beautiful architecture. The public art inside it is super fun as well too. But because the public engagement was done so with it, the community kind of hates it, and it's such a shame that this beautiful building with the great programming that it has to offer now has this negative tint in the community, and the smallest act of public engagement could have turned that around. Even just letting people know that, hey, a library is coming into your community, like even that minimal amount of effort in public engagement could have turned the public perception around on this awesome building. Another thing that motivates me when it comes to public engagement is that there's so much potential for growth and so much potential for us to rethink about it differently. Like, it kind of breaks my heart sometimes that people defer to or make the default option be town halls when it comes to public engagement. There's so many fun and engaging and inspiring ways to do public engagement that still need to be tapped into. Some of my favorite artists have taken the stance of reimagining how you engage the community. One of my favorite projects was that I had a chance to kind of participate in and witness was Yoko Ono's Wish Tree project. I was very fortunate to be part of the Nuit Blanche that happened in Edmonton in 2015. And as part of that festival, we invited Yoko Ono to share her Wish Tree project. And for those of you who don't know, Nuit Blanche is a all-night festival. And I was amazed by how late in people were willing to participate in her Wish Tree project, writing down wishes and hanging them on trees in our downtown core. And at the end of the night, it was very formative for me because I made the correlation that this is what public engagement could be. At the end of the night, we managed to collect 10,000 wishes, and that was just based off of the simple question. It was like, of what's your wish for the future? Can you imagine how powerful that exhibit would have been if the question was, what is your wish for a safe and vibrant city? Like, that would have been amazing. Or what are your wishes towards building strong relationships with all members of your community? Like, if that question was framed that way, can you imagine the impact that installation would have had for the entire city? So whenever I think about public engagement, I think about that night, and I think about what's possible in terms of inspiring to participate, to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you. Yes, I sometimes think that the public is underestimated when people talk about the public. Sometimes I hear that a lot. And also, I think one of the things I am really interested is extending the timelines of rather than thinking of like a singular event, like just a longer timeline, like a longer sense of time, because I think engagement is really, it's long, it takes time to develop rapport. Kay, do you feel like answering a little bit? What's your motivation? No,
Yeah, for sure.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, and for sure. So a lot of my motivation and kind of what I do work as somebody who primarily works with young people is really creating spaces and holding their boundaries for them when it comes to engagement from adults and especially government in Nova Scotia. They all really want to talk to them. They really want to talk to the most diverse like youth they can find, but they actually don't want to talk to them. And they're actually not listening, and they just want a box that they engage them. So as a youth worker, a lot of my work is really saying, no, if you want to engage with young people, I need to see your process. I need to see why. I need to see what is the outcome so that we're setting them up for the most success. And I want you also to compensate them fairly. And pizza's not fair. Like that's everybody's like, oh, we'll just feed them. I'm like, no. If you want a 3-hour, 2-hour engagement session with young people, you're paying like you would pay an adult expert. So that's a lot of my work, and it's like a little bit it annoys people, and I'm quite annoying sometimes to people who come to us, especially because everybody wants to engage young people, but they just want to because they think that's what they should do. But they don't actually have a purpose in mind, and they don't have an outcome. And people will talk to you, and they'll give you amazing feedback and stuff, but they want to that their voice counts, and that you're actually listening to them and not just checking a box. So in the work that I do, that's kind of what motivates me in this like kind of interesting part of, I think, the youth world and as well as the government world in Nova Scotia that people don't often think about. And I guess they're just really important to engage as well because they're building our future. So if you are wanting to build stronger communities and a stronger like next whatever you're engaging on, you really need to talk to the young people as well in like meaningful ways.
Yes, I mean, I think that, yeah, you just have to, if you really want to make change, you just have to get used to being in pain. It's like really weird because you have to be like both sensitive, so you could like don't get too tough and get desensitized, but then also like not afraid of being unpopular. And just like a professional disruptor. Yeah, I mean, I think it's all, I mean, I think a lot of it just has to do with how capitalism is organized. It's just, I just always come back to the economy. I'm obsessed with economies now. And I just see everything comes back to the economy. So the whole like box checking, it's like, it's the economy. So to counteract that, it's about like time and like relationship building. Yeah. I'm just gonna have a look at my other questions. Hold on, already 6.
So I took a look at your other questions ahead of time, and there's kind of a natural segue between what we're talking about when you're talking about industry and consumerism. So that's what I find with, because I've done a lot of different community engagement processes. I've done them from very small grassroots ones to like ones that were like developed big policy that were provincial that ended up, informing government policy. So that's the range that I've been involved in. And you're totally right in that there's a complete absence of relationship building, which is really ironic for the time that we're in, right?
That's how you control the economy. It's like,
yeah,
it's like, even this so simplistic, but anti-Black racism was a result of the slave trade for getting like free labor. It's just, like, it wasn't the motivation, it was the result. The narrative corrects itself. We just have to build other economies and not pay attention to the narrative, but it's like, it's lethal. I mean, people die because of it. But yeah,
it's interesting because we're talking, there's a question there around like what does a decolonial process look like in this conversation. And I think the big thing we need to recognize, like, what kind of culture we actually operate from. So if you're going to talk about that, essentially what you're saying is you have to flip that around. And basically what that means is it's coming back to a relational understanding between each other. And it's not a process. It's not relationships that are based off of like tit for tat, like you give me something so that I can get something kind of thing. It's not, and then that some people would argue that that's reciprocal, right? Reciprocity, but that's not how it actually works in terms of, say, if you were to talk about land base, right? That's not how it actually is. And what really is happening is it's like the example that Kayla gave about governments coming in and wanting to talk to people, right? Talk to youth, talk to survivors in my case, talk to, racialized artists, different people that they don't necessarily, have at their tables, right? But it's totally right. Like you're exactly right in saying that you can't just and to extract. It's a culture of extraction. And that's what we need to start pointing at. And I think we're doing a better job of that now more than I've ever seen, really getting down to the nitty gritty of like what the problem is. And that's ultimately what it is. But yet at the same time, we're always going to run into issues when the leadership is so used to extraction of resources, seeing people and land and communities as resources, right? So it's a big feat, like it's a big challenge that we have, but it really can be done very simply. And like, my colleagues here have already, pointed out some things, but like one of the things that we are always advocating for, at least for myself and my communities, is like, yeah, you can't just come in and then also not working from a trauma-informed lens and re-traumatizing communities, re-victimizing communities. No, you need to be held, you need to be responsible. So there's also work for the other side to do things if you're going to ask a community for something, right? So it really is about everybody standing in their truth and recognizing where it is that they're speaking from. And like Kayla was saying, have a goal. What is your goal, right? What are you trying to get? And if you don't know, that's like the first warning bell that I have that goes off, like, oh, that's kind of concerning if you don't actually know why you are asking these questions, right? But yeah, it's all about relationship building, and we have to remember that our whole country, right, we're in the situation that we're in because, backs were turned towards the people that made the relations, that built the relationship, right? So it's a big conversation, but those are the kind of the smaller steps, is like, building relationships, but which would require trust, but also require you to actually want to have a long-term relationship, right? And again, reflecting back as a mirror to like our society, it's so quick, right? We want it now. We don't want to wait, we want it to happen fast. We want what we want because we want it. And it's not based in honoring each other, right? And that's why, that's a lot of what decolonial work is actually about, is like getting back to honoring our sovereignty. And really, it's kind of like a big metaphor for honoring treaties and our relationships, when it really goes back all the way around to it, right? And everybody is a treaty person, right? So everybody can benefit from that and we have things in place that were there to tell us how to have the best relationships with each other, the relationships with the land, so that we could get taken care of, right? So these things, although we're talking about art and community practices, it's all interconnected, because that's the basis of where that knowledge comes from. And it's countering extraction culture, which is all about compartmentalizing and disconnecting, right?
I don't want to I feel some of the things I want to respond to will take the conversation. I think it's related, but maybe not directly. But I often think of money as kind of like it's a shortcut. You don't have to deal with people. Like you don't have to deal with feeling or listen to them or having a long relationship with them and being kind. You just set a price. You got the transaction and you're gone. It's I think it is. I really think it's people's inability to deal with relationships. That's how money came about. Anyways, maybe that's a different rant, but I think it's all related because, yeah, I mean, I think the trouble that we've gotten into is because of shortcuts, like emotional and economic shortcuts. So one of the things I was hearing you say is it made me think of like COVID and the lessons. And what were the lessons that you think you learned and how did it change your practice? I will say one of the biggest things I thought about was, besides time and looking at the economy, was also just like listening. I feel like we were to listen, and that's why some things happened. Yeah.
I've got such a good answer for this, but I want to let Jamie go because Jamie's got his hands up.
How I got this with the connection.
Go, Jamie.
Yeah, so I could listen to you talk for a while, Lindsey. That was such a great what you shared was great, and I just wanted to.
I talk for a living.
I want to kind of harken back to your point about relationships. If you want to engage the community and you've yet to create a relationship with them, it's too late. Which is why I'm of the mind that if you are a part of an organization or a group that aims to serve the community or serve your city or to serve the public, it is your duty to create relationships with everybody you serve, regardless of whether or not a public engagement opportunity is coming up or not, because you want to be able to, there's nothing worse than asking a community, what do you need when it comes to a public engagement question? Because that only demonstrates that you haven't made a relationship with them and you're listening to them. Because I guarantee you that the question of what do you need has been asked multiple times before in the past. So if anyone takes anything from this conversation today, it's make those relationships before you need to call on those relationships when it comes to public engagement. Try and figure out how to understand what the needs are of a community. You don't need a public engagement project to develop a relationship with a community. Understanding what they're about, being genuinely interested in how they are a part of your community is enough of a starting point to develop a relationship. And I highly stress doing that well before you have to call on them for a public engagement project.
Kayla, you want to say something? I see you nodding, that's why.
I definitely agree with you, Jamie. I think that's always like, I guess one is like, well, what do you need? And then oftentimes people aren't ready to answer that. They don't want to actually that. Like a lot of the times, like especially like my community, they're like, what do you need? I'm like, we want our land back. And then they're like, we can't do that. I'm like, then why did you ask that question? If you know you can't do it, don't ask a question. Or if you don't want to do the answer, it's like, DFO, I need you to stop taking our lobster traps out of the water. And they're like, can't do that. Like, don't ask me what I need if you're not going to listen to my answer. Try to like find a middle. And I think going back to your second question, when you're thinking about like what has COVID kind of taught us, or like realizations that came from COVID, I think the biggest one I see a lot right now is like what COVID kind of taught me is people got a little bit lazy, and they now, if they talk to one Native person, that they have all the Native people in Canada's opinion on something. Just the amount of like pan-Indianism, and it's not just Indigenous groups, it happens with so many other groups. They're like, oh yes, this one person agrees with me, especially politicians. That's their favorite thing. If they can find one person who agrees with them, they're like, oh, the whole community agrees. And then they only ever asked one person. And that's not true community engagement. And I find that's really false, and it's not fair, because people who are not as engaged and involved in the conversation or are passionate about it as you might not care enough to actually go look at how they engaged. They might just say, oh yeah, that makes sense that that one Indigenous person agreed that this is a great thing. So everybody else, they're just complaining because they want to complain. When in reality, they found the one person who agrees with them and is ignoring everybody else. So I think COVID made people a little bit lazy that way, because it was so much harder to make relationships and to do some of the bigger engagements because of numbers, and then you have the barriers of technology. you had to be kind of privileged to engage in different things. Like you had to want to, you had to have the mental space, you had to have the technology, the understanding of technology. You ever try to put an elder on Zoom, they don't really know it and they don't really like what's happening. So like a lot of people were left out, I think, when we did engagement via COVID.
Yeah, I think to build off that a little bit, Kayla, COVID really taught, well, like even before COVID, like I knew there were deep inequities around how folks are engaged in the process of their engagement, but COVID really taught me the depth of how deep that inequity was. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so
Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting. So, of course, right off the top is, especially for the social work aspect of what I do, a lot of what we kind of are combating, you know, in anti-trafficking efforts, gang involvement efforts, they all went really underground and also not seen enough, right? Because everybody was on computers, right? Everybody was in their homes. So it actually made certain parts of our even more vulnerable than they already were. So that was something that was really tricky for us. And then as workers, we also were limited to what we could do, right? So that was another layer. And then as far as the community engaging pieces, yes, right away, it was showing very stark inequities for particular people. And for even for myself, for example, like I live on a territory, which is like one of the biggest reserves in Canada. And my internet was, you know, and it still is. I still don't have internet access to where, you know, the rest of the country does, right? Let alone, you know, then we talk about water, that's another other thing, right? So there was that, and then access to technology. It was very much showing, you know, that class of people that could actually function in that space. And there was a whole section of people that got left behind. And classically, it was the same people that normally are left behind in a lot of conversations. So, but even further pushed out. So it created more isolation. So that was something that was obviously a challenge. And that's still kind of a challenge because a lot of models are hybrid now. So we're still trying to work with that. On the positive side, from what I saw, is that there was a lot more supports coming up for communities to be able to digitize. So there's a lot more spaces that were created for like online classrooms, like et cetera, things like those that actually brought some community together and continue to do that now. So that's interesting. But for myself, in my practice, and again, this could just be that I think of everything from a spiritual perspective as well. So for me, it's really, really interesting what COVID actually brought us, which in essence, the way that I've seen it is really a collective fast. So we do something in our communities, it's called fasting. And essentially it's where you're kind of going, you know, you're going into nature to reconnect with what's out there, but more specifically, like more often than not with yourself. And so when we're having these bigger conversations around like, what does good engagement look like? It's about that relationship building. And ultimately you can't have relations with other people if you don't have a relationship with yourself. So it's interesting that, you know, we all collectively had a big fast where we were separated from each other. And it's almost kind of like, and then combined with the environmental impacts that were happening up until, it's almost like there was a shut off button where it was like, yeah, you guys have had enough of doing things on the trajectory of where you were going, of not relating very well, of damaging the earth, of being disconnected from yourself, which disconnected from your communities, right? So we're going to really, I say we, I mean like spirit, right? Like earth, spirit, really putting us all in an isolation of a thinking spot, an introspective spot. Did everybody do that? I don't know. I would say probably not, because there's some people that were chopping at the bit to like go back to normal, right? But when clearly what we've been doing isn't necessarily working to the best of the way it could be. So to me, COVID taught me a lot of different things around, you know, really showing us in our faces the inequity, right? The challenges of you know, whose voices were being heard and weren't. And then also it was an opportunity for us to all really get together and realign how we were going to emerge out of this and do better, right? With that time of reflection. But like I said, did everybody do that? I'm not quite sure. We're still kind of seeing how that's unfolding. So yeah, and again, like relating is a skill, right? So it's also interesting too, because as we're coming out of this, we're finding new ways to relate and try to relate better, and basically having a reset on how we actually relate to one another. So it's really interesting. That's at least what I've learned from COVID.
Well, you know, the other thing too, though, is that how quickly things can be done. Like, it's possible. It's just some people aren't willing. Things can be done quickly, and you see it. This is why I love about grassroots is you see it's like, I love it. It's just like task force mentality. You just like get things done. So I don't know. I hope everybody doesn't forget and get like distracted with COVID. Like, things can be done. It's just a question of making them impossible not to do. And then with that, you have to somehow incorporate me, unfortunately, to convince people. Okay, so if you are thinking of your dream project now, given all your like life experience, I hear maybe because I've also thought, like many people, about giving land back. But what's your dream like most useful community project? Not asking you what you need, but like where can we go? What can we do?
I think not necessarily a project, but more so a day of doing things and figuring out how to kind of change the practice. You know, for me, I'd love for the people who the decisions are being made for to be at the table at the beginning, to be able to design what those engagements look like, to be able to kind of like understand what community needs and have that be the practice shift. That's kind of like my dream, and figuring out how to make that more widely practiced.
Yeah, just to clarify, when I say project, I don't like compartmentalize everything. So it could be like a lifestyle project. It could be something that takes 40 years, not with like a short timeline, but
You can speak a little bit to, I think, my work and what we have like slowly been like progressing and getting, and I would just love to see it continuing, which for us is taking back mental health care for young people and putting it in community versus institutions. So my work as a recreation therapist, we use art and mindfulness every week to build young people's resiliency and coping skills and mechanisms and help their families build stronger. And like my hope is that they like the realm continues and the like respect for this realm continues to grow, because the less young people we have to have interact with the formal mental health system is honestly the better, because we all know that system is not the best, especially for any BIPOC young person, any 2S LGBTQ plus person. Like, that's not it at all. So I think, yeah, my dream is that like that continues to happen, and it's not just mental health, like other parts are given back to community. Like we can start like giving community things that we know that if they were funded and cared for properly, that they could manage themselves and do. And we wouldn't need to have big institutions that just make us more marginalized, more divided, and actually don't help the way that they're supposed to help. So that's my big dream.
Yeah, I mean, I really think institutions just pick up like cultural flack. Like, institutions exist because the cultural, the system is not like, you know, like we're not caring for each other. So then it's like made into like a business, you know.
Yeah, to add to that, well, essentially what I'm hearing that is like, you know, we're over the paternal, our communities are 100% capable and have been capable for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, we have whole systems that were in place prior to contact that allowed us to, again, like I said earlier, relate to one another. You know, if you want to hear like a story about like one of the best community engagement coordinators ever, would be like the peacemaker that's part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? Like the Hawaii Confederacy. So, I mean, that's just if anybody's interested to research that, that's kind of like a little nerd out moment I just had. But you can see it. We have clear, you know, examples of what that looks like. But my dream is really just, you know, and it really is like to what Kayla's saying, like land back, right? Like community back, like give us our communities and our land back. Like it's literally, it's simple, but again, and I do a whole other talk about this, which connects, you know, people and like consumerism, that whole culture around land and resources. Like the whole reason for colonialism is land and resources, 100%. Any which way you spin it, it's always going to be that. So like what you're saying when you're acknowledging around capitalism, like that's a huge part of it. Our capitalism, a paternalistic structure, right? That's really what is really damaging. And you got to think about it in terms of like, again, connected back to the land. It seems simple, but the land in a lot of Indigenous cultures is referenced as the mother. Like there's a big connection there in terms of like matriarchy and feminine energy that's more of it's not so dominant in like action. It's like receiving, and it's heart-based, right? And the only way you can do the opposite is if you take away that. So that's where you see us get into troubles in terms of our communities and building relationships, and something as simple as community engagement, right? Is that we are disconnected from that. So we need to start working, going back to connecting and, you know, really implementing, like, yeah, like really, if you're talking about a project, like I would just love to live in a land-based culture. Like yes, this is, you know, we're not going to get away from like our computers, like, and we have phones and like these things, but there's a way we can have a balance that doesn't injure our spirits, because that's what's happening over and over and over again. That's why we can never like make any progress. And there's people that benefit off of spirit injury. And there's a reason why it's not incorporated in mainstream health or education or whatever, right? Because again, it's that disconnection. If you keep people disconnected from each other, from themselves, from the land, you can get at it easier.
I always wanted to start like a BIPOC, sort of a BIPOC safe scouts program. Farm school.
Yeah, and there's organizations that are doing that. Like there's in Ontario anyway, we have a really good one called Grandmother's Voice, and it's 100% led by Indigenous women, which is amazing. And that's like a major founding component of their programming is all land-based activity, and land-based activity translating to like life skills, how to take care of yourself, how to process emotion, how to, you know, do all of those things. So if you stay, and again, it makes it harder, right, for you to have like a very tunnel vision of like what to be, like what your goals are, of like why you're doing what you're doing. So it's really interesting, and I see more and more of it coming up now than ever before. And then the funding part, I mean, I think that's also inherent in land back as well, right? Is you know, the authority or the overseeing of funding and funds is the other part of it, right? Where again, another thing we're not necessarily going to get away from is the money aspect of everything, every part of our society. But again, it's shining a light in a mirror to who makes those decisions and what are they making the decisions on exactly, right? And doing what we need to do as people in our communities doing this type of work to help people see more and more truth so that they can start asking questions in their areas, and then it's like a ripple, right? Then it gets more and more people, then eventually they can't not answer. Right?
I always thought it'd be a good idea for any immigrant that comes into the country that they have, I don't know, at least 2 years where they have to actively work on land, like not solely, but have a program that sort of helps people feel like responsible for the land.
Kind of building off of what you were talking about, Lindsay, about just the disconnect from not only the land, from each other. This is kind of like an issue that, or a problem that I don't necessarily have the answer for, but I'm just curious what everybody thinks about. Is I'm finding that there's a differentiation between like community and neighborhood, whereas like a neighborhood is kind of like your geographic space within the land, and community is who you choose to be in relation with, is the who, whereas neighborhood is kind of like the I'm finding with like this growing disconnect between people that it almost doesn't matter where you live, because there's so many ways for you to the community that works you. And the downside of that is that we no longer have the skills to be able to be community in neighborhoods with each other and have differing views around issues. And I think communities that are highly engaged but have differing views are the richest communities. With this disconnect, we're seeing a lot of awful things, especially when it comes to polarization and just people not being able to see other people as people. I'm curious as to hear about what folks' thoughts are on that, and how we might navigate this issue.
So right away, what's coming to my mind is like in my communities, specifically the way we have something called the condolences ceremony. And every time we have a meeting, like any type of important community meeting, the condolences is recited. There's a whole ceremony that goes along with that. And essentially what that is to honor each other's grief, because grief is one of the main leaders of like why we get into so much conflict with one another. So when we can acknowledge, those tough areas of our experiences, right, then we're able to do things to kind of release that from one another and support each other. And then we can come to the table with clear minds. So that's really interesting because it's honoring the individual, but also, realigning everybody into like why we're actually like, what's our goal, what's the goal, right? So that's an indigenous practice that is really, really, like I've seen it work like in practice, and it's really, really amazing. But ultimately, from a community engagement perspective, like when I know when we've done, like when I've been involved in some really large scale ones, it's really driving home, but also, okay, so it's interesting because you could say that, right? Honor everyone's voice, right? That's easier said than done. I think what it really comes down to is that people need to mean it, right? And you mean it if you follow it by action, which is, again, contributing something back to that community, right? You can't take unless you give something. If we're talking about reciprocity, right? Like true reciprocity. So that all, again, will play into like building trust. It'll play into all of those things. But like we said from the beginning, it's like longer lasting relationships, right? Incorporating it in right from the get-go that this is not just a one-off thing. This is something we're going to continue to visit and continue to listen. We're going to continue to tell truths and support one another in that neighborhood or that community for a long period of time. And one of the things that, I've done over time in different projects and things is like inviting people back to see the finished result, right? Having them be included in what that actually is. And so that there's even some closure too, because that's something that happens a lot of in our communities and then even in society generally, is like leaving things open-ended when, sometimes that does more damage down the road. And you kind of feel kind of like you're left up in the air. So that's what I would say is like there's a lot of things that we could be doing, but ultimately it's supporting people again too in learning how to relate. Because we're kind of coming back from that of like so many years of not relating very well, right?
Okay, yeah, I'd love to hear your perspective on how you like youth navigate this, because I find youth are really good at finding their own community wherever they need to, and not so much the kind of like neighborhood or kind of geography that they're kind of in. And that's I don't know if it's good or bad, but like if youth struggle in relating to like the neighborhoods and the kind of immediate communities that they're a part of, how do we make them feel like they belong or own or trust the communities that they're a part of?
Sure, I think that's one of the amazing strengths I find that young people have, is that they are really good at finding their own community and also like finding their own family. So even if their home is not that, they create these spaces. And I think the thing I love about my job is helping foster these spaces. So really, they build something together. And then once they kind of build it, it's interesting because more youth just come. Like you start off with like 3 and you're like, okay, cool, there's 3. But then suddenly you have 20. You don't really know how you ended up with 20. But they kind of just all figured out that like they have something in common. They have something that they're getting from this space, whether that is friendship, whether that is acceptance, whether that is somebody to debate Harry Potter back and forth with for like 5 hours at a time, that they're getting something out of this space that they've created for themselves. And I've learned that they don't even care sometimes if they're taking an hour to drive. If that is the one spot where they feel like they can be themselves, use the pronouns they want, use the name that they want, they will drive. They will make their parents take an hour, they'll take buses, they'll kind of do whatever they have to do. I think the interesting thing COVID showed us, especially with our program, is that that space doesn't actually have to be them together in a room. They can still foster and create their community on Zoom, in Discord, even playing like video games online together. They are still able to make themselves that space and get the supports and their needs met from each other. And they're not tied at all. Like you said, they're not really tied to their neighborhoods. Like they don't feel those. Like I don't know many young people who would be like, yes, my neighborhood is my community. I feel like they would be, not even their schools. Like there's a bunch of them that don't even feel safe and that their school is for them. So I think the lovely part is when you can give them that spot somewhere, and watching that like magic happen. And yeah, they're not bound by geographic locations. They're not bound by a building even. They want to be together. And it's like their little spirits connect somehow when they're in the same room together.
But then my question is, what happens to those spaces that they don't feel safe in? Do they continue to function the way that make them feel unsafe and unwelcomed?
They don't. And I see that so much with young people, especially their mental health and in school, of just like the school is such a toxic space for them and they're not learning anything. The school doesn't care that they're not learning anything. They just want to get through the door as fast as they can and then be out of it. And they don't get to like be them full selves. Like, especially art wise, when you have them in a school, they're trying to do art versus in the community, they're like so different. They're like, oh, I hate art. I'm no good at art. But their idea of art is like, somebody's going to grade me on how I did the grayscale, not what color of purple matches my mood right now. And when you help them decolonize art, which is a big part of my work, is really having them break away from the school system and that there is expectations and kind of tapping back into when they were young children and they just made art because art was fun. And then they get to have those spaces, be themselves, and like learn that art is not like school. It never will be outside of any school. So I think I'll go a lot in spaces where they don't feel safe. And it's a shame that school is one of those biggest spaces for young people. Like it kind of breaks my heart that you would think school should be the one spot where they feel safe and protected, but for most of them, it's not at all.
Just have a few minutes left. I don't know if anybody has any questions they would like to ask, but also I'd say that also that was, I feel very lucky with the COVID getting some insight into the school and seeing how violent a system it is actually. And it's not based, well, for the public school anyways, I find it's not based on education, but it's just organizational and sort of daycare. Are there any questions from the audience? Would you like to type up? Okay, there is a question from the chat that I will read out. Jennifer, are you okay if I read this out? So Jennifer K, hello everyone. As a second generation Asian woman in becoming a certified forest therapy guide, my pivotal experience was in reconnection to land and self-creative reawakening, which has been an important initial step of being able to connect more authentically with both physical land and social community. Now I have begun introducing friends in public to the experience of guided forest therapy walk to help individual reconnect to land, self, and others, my effort to community engagement. Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. That's great. Well, I hope we can all continue our conversation however we can with, I think, the link. Repost it there so people can build, keep relationship building. Put it in the chat, everyone. And I'm saving the chat so I can share that with people after. Does anybody have any last comments they would like to add, or any resources? You can add them later in the Google Doc.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Jennifer's comment in the chat. I think that's like one of the best ways to do public engagement is to get a person out of their space and then ask them the question. Because to ask someone a question while they're in their space, when they're in their home, when they're in their kind of zone, it's too easy to fall back on answers that make you feel comfortable and perspectives that make you feel comfortable. If you can take someone outside and put them in a space of wonder, like a forest, that's a great space for a conversation. Or if you can take someone outside and bring them to a gallery or expose them to art and then have that question, it's just that much more impactful for me.
Yeah, this is, I've always loved that for art as well, is that people, while they're creating, if they can relax, they can sort of, you can be vulnerable and let down your guard and talk about things while looking at something else. Yeah. And it's interesting because the childhood and people's relationship to art often has like a really long shadow. So I mean, even talking to elders who had art practices in their 70s, they still remember their childhood and those same ideas that they developed at school about like not being able to do perspective and stuff. Any other or resources people would like to share? I have things that I'll add to the Google Doc, some projects that are really inspiring. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, I would just like to thank you, Anna, for such a great job moderating tonight. I really enjoyed just listening in on this really important conversation. I would also like to thank our lovely engagement team for the tech help on the back end, as well as our ASL and LSQ interpreters. This is the first time for me as well presenting simultaneous French translation. So yeah, thank you all for joining us for this lovely talk. I think especially when we're talking about reimagining community engagement, it's important to really make sure accessibility is at the forefront of that and ensure that all of those communities we're trying to engage with are able to engage meaningfully. I would also like to thank our funders, the CreateSpace Residency, hosting this talk in collaboration with Shaping Space is supported by the City of Toronto as part of Artworks TO Toronto's Year of Public Art, as well as TD Bank through the TD Ready Commitment, Canada Council for the Arts, and Ontario Arts Council. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Jaime, Lindsey, Kayla, and Anna for this lovely conversation. It has been extremely valuable to me. I've learned a lot. As Anna mentioned, we could sit here and discuss this forever, but we want to be respectful of people's time. So yeah, thank everyone for making the time tonight to join in on this. And yeah, this is recorded and we will be sharing this. And thank you for all of those also joining us through Facebook Live. Have a lovely night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.